Hi everyone, I'm Jack Threadling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. The library tour is continuing, and since we're still in Nonfiction November, at least as of this recording, I thought it would be fun to dig out all of our NYRB classics that are some type of nonfiction. And there's a few main groups, sort of literary criticism and essays, memoirs, travel writing, but there are a few really interesting one-offs. And of course, the great colors of spines. So let's start with this one off, The Anatomy of Melancholy from Robert Burton. What a book, what a strange book. Burton, writing in the 17th century, goes in and is basically just exploring all the different ways in which people can become sad. Loss of friends, loss of wealth, loss of family, broken heart, all of those things. But he then gets into things like overwork, certainly relevant in 2021. And he's exploring the symptoms, and he's all over the place. This book represents a very particular slice of European reading history, I'll say. And to me, it's that 150 years after the invention of the printing press, when books are no longer restricted to a handful of locales, primarily monasteries, or the very wealthy, but rather they are the playground of many minds. But there's still this ephemeral sense to them that if I'm going to borrow a book from a lending library or from a friend, once I finish reading that and return it, I'm probably never going to possess that book again. Somebody else is going to have it. And so any idea I find in that book that's worth noting, I'm going to write down to be able to reference. And with that then, we get this literary noblesse oblige that is really strange, where certain writers felt that, gosh, if I'm going to write a book, I could fill it with references from everything I've read. So that way whoever reads my book has a taste, a sense at least, of all these other books that they may never actually hold and possess. And Burton seems to be doing that. This book is filled with examples and quotations, and he's just pulling from everywhere. Within one, we'll get a reference on Vespasian, we'll get a reference on some 13th century Florentine merchant. We'll get a reference from Burton's own contemporary days. And some of the references will be in Latin. Others are translated. And the book just rolls. It can be, I think at least, it's been more fun to dip in and out of it. It's reading 10 pages here, 20 pages here, 30 pages here, rather than sitting and reading the whole book cover to cover. I would be really curious to know if any of you have sat down and read it over the course of 2-3 weeks. Cover to cover, and if what you got from that experience. I just find that I enjoy kind of getting in, reading a section, and sort of noting what I think on that, and then moving forward a month later, 2 months later. So that's how I've been enjoying The Anatomy of Melancholy. But let me know. Additionally, it's Burton was sort of a near contemporary of Shakespeare. He was born in 1577. The first edition of Anatomy of Melancholy was published in the 1620s. So we do get another side of sort of Stuart England, which could be interesting, I suppose, for historical interest. But yeah, I'm curious about that. If you've read the histories of Herodotus, and you've noticed that he likes digressions, which I do too, and he takes us to Egypt for a whole book, Burton is doing that at a pace that feels much closer to the 21st century. He is just zinging all over the place. And I think sometimes it can be hard to keep pace with him. Up next, another writer who likes to do that, Girolamo Cardano, the book of my life, a member of the Italian Renaissance. Cardano even came up with a little math equation that's still used today, formula. So he was an interesting writer, and he manages to produce an interesting series of aphorisms, reflections, essays to a certain degree, without ever being interesting because he fought in a bunch of battles or had a bunch of romantic conquests. Like his is very much his adventures of the mind. He has this great aphorism, something around, I was condemned because I stood alone in my opinions. For this very reason do we value the unicorn so highly, because it is so rare. So we have a self-proclaimed unicorn writing this book. My own personal connection is I was reading it in 2019, when our younger daughter took her first steps. I was actually reading Cardano's essay on sports and exercise. A Renaissance attitude on sports and exercise in 2019. And our younger daughter took that moment to run from the ottoman like across to the wall where the front door is, and I was dropped the book and grabbed, to get a video because my wife was asleep. So I've really enjoyed reading that. Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies from Robert Kirk, writing, I don't know, couple generations after Burton. We have this strange book that draws conclusions. Kirk actually draws conclusions at the end of this 90-page exploration of all of the interesting creatures that live out there in the wilds with him in Scotland. So certainly a curiosity, but again gives that sort of 17th century feel of English. Moving into sort of more the criticism genre now. We have Poets in a Landscape from Gilbert Hyatt. I did a video on this in the summer of 2020. It was one of the best nonfiction books I read in 2020. I loved it. I still have returned to it a couple of times since then. Hyatt is giving us some translations of various Roman poets, some criticism, some ideas around their poetry and themes they explore. We get a little bit of biography on the poets, we get a little bit of Roman history, but we get this last piece that really elevates this book and makes it one that I enjoy returning to. And that is that Hyatt went and I think in the 1950s it was, went and spent time in Italy or places in Europe where these poets had either been born or lived, and spoken with the local individuals who lived there, spoken with archaeologists, trying to get a sense of that place, and then looking for that place in the poetry. And so it's fantastic. This book is wonderful. I cannot recommend it highly enough. War in the Iliad. This is a pair of essays. We have Simone Weil and Rachel Bespaloff. I always get the name wrong. And it's really a pair of essays written in the, I want to say Simone Weil's is from 1939, Bespaloff's from the 1940s, but right in certainly one of the darkest periods of human history, on the edge of and then in the midst of the Holocaust. And these two writers really explore war as form, but war as horror to a large degree. And it's, you don't have to have read the Iliad to appreciate the power of these two essays, but I think for people who have read the Iliad, this would be highly recommended reading. Collected Essays of Elizabeth Hardwick. This is new to my reading. I just picked it up, I want to say in early October, and I've really enjoyed what I've been able to sample so far. These collect Hardwick's non-theater, non-drama essays over the course of a career. And there are times it's interesting. She is interesting in terms of just what she wants to explore, and who she wants to spend time writing about and exploring. But there are also times, certainly later on, where she's willing to go against the grain of the literary establishment. And so certain writers, she'll be writing in the 1990s and certainly taking on certain, pantheon writers in the US or in Europe, and she's willing to do that. And so it's interesting to get that vibe as well. I'm going to be continuing to enjoy that book. When the World Spoke French by Marc Fumaroli, another strange one-off in the NYRB Classics, and a book that I sort of happened on, and I feel very fortunate to have happened on. This book is primarily a mosaic of the 18th century in Europe, and it is a highlighting various individuals who were not native French speakers, but had correspondence that they wrote to in French. And some of these are very famous, like public figures: Frederick the Great, Catherine the Great, Benjamin Franklin pops up, Governor Morris, Walpole, Viscount Bolingbroke. And others are more, sort of, they weren't famous statespeople, they were advisors, diplomats, just individuals who were in that orbit. But Fumaroli does a great job of presenting sort of a historical view of who this person is, who they're interacting with, what was sort of their job, why is this person relevant, and then what do the letters reveal. And then when it was originally published in French, it would just give the letters that were written in French. They're all translated for this edition. But it's interesting to sort of explore these interactions. And what I have found is it's the lesser lights who produced some of the most interesting moments in this book so far. So I'm really enjoying it. Anyone who's interested in the 18th century or interested in sort of the Enlightenment, I think would really enjoy this book. Going forward, we have a bunch of memoirs / travel writing with the great Patrick Leigh Fermor. Probably most famous for A Time of Gifts, which has been really, really fun to read. I'm sort of trying to take this at the pace he took his journey. He set out in 1933 after some issues at school to backpack across Europe. And students of history will know that something else happened in 1933 that led to a whole lot of horror. And that shadow hangs over this book because Patrick Leigh Fermor did not write this in 1933 as he was like walking along. He wrote it years later in the aftermath of World War II, in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And there's a sense of adventure, there's a sense of joy in what he was able to experience. But the sense of loss is also very present in the narrative. And it kind of is underneath much of it. That the places he walked across, many of them, are forever changed. By the time, this trip ends, that process of change has started and it's irrevocable. But it's A Time of Gifts in particular, I think is just, there is a real sense of joy, and of this not quite nostalgic lost joy that he experienced. And of course this time in Vienna is interesting, but he spends nights in castles. He has a great sort of New Year's party with some young Germans that he meets. And there are definitely delights in this book, which is followed with Between the Woods and the Water, where he then is sort of crossing across Hungary and then down towards the Balkans. And then he eventually, I believe it was posthumously published, there's The Broken Road, which takes him then all the way down to Istanbul. And I'm looking forward to getting to Between the Woods and the Water next year, and then The Broken Road after. He also, with being someone who had traveled quite a bit in the 30s, was able to speak many languages and work with different cultures. He was a real asset to the British during World War II, and so he had a very interesting and heroic career during World War II. Afterwards, he then spent a fair amount of time in Greece, and so we have Mani travels in the southern Peloponnese, and Roumeli travels in northern Greece. And I have spent more time in Mani, but I'm certainly looking forward to getting to Roumeli. I enjoy spending time with Patrick Leigh Fermor. And then finally, A Time to Keep Silence, which is a really interesting, very short book where he goes to, I believe it's 3 locations where there are different monasteries in Europe. And it's just his reflection of his time there, including, if the members of the monastery have taken a vow of silence, what does that mean for his own interaction as he's going to be there? Another series of letters from a traveling individual. We have the letters from Russia of Astolphe de Custine. These are from the late 1830s, maybe early 1840s. So I believe we're in Tsar Nicholas I. Correct me if I'm wrong, students of history. And the serfs still exist. So we have a French sort of semi-aristocrat traveling through Tsarist Russia and sharing his reflections on that. And he has a very specific view of what he sees, he can be very critical. He can also sort of note interesting things historically, but he can be very critical of what he sees under Tsarist Russia. If you've seen the film Russian Ark, which famously is this like long one take through the palace, and then all of the scenes, and the camera just keeps moving, and you see all these different scenes from Russian history. I believe the guide, who's the tall guy wearing like the black coat who in the curly like sort of gray hair, is supposed to be Astolphe de Custine. And that sort of leads into the notebooks from Victor Serge, 1936 to 1947. Serge was a Russian revolutionary. He left Russia. He was sort of exiled from Russia during the reign of Stalin, and ultimately then fled to Mexico in the fall of France in 1940. And so these are his memories of what's going on. Really, his conversations with other exiles, with the news they're getting from Russia, people who have just disappeared, people who they know have been murdered, what is going on. We have, of course, his views on the totalitarian regime of the Soviet Union, but also then his views on Nazi Germany, those horrors, World War II itself, and then even at the end, is it now safe to go back to Europe for some of people who are like old Bolsheviks to a certain degree? Serge is probably most famous for Memoirs of a Revolutionary. He also has several novels. I think this book is really interesting because these aren't op-eds that he was publishing. These were really him sitting down and remembering his conversations, and the editor notes when he misremembers conversations, or when the conversation includes misremembered or misheard details that Serge was recording. But this is interesting to read. It can also be very sad to read. Asymptotically approaching the sadness that is Inhuman Land from Józef Czapski. So Czapski was Polish. This is actually one of his paintings. And he was living as a prisoner of war in the early part of World War II, when the Soviets had taken, with the partition of Poland, and there were parts of the Polish army and Polish citizenry that were put into POW camps or concentration camps. And so his book Lost Time is a series of lectures he gave on Proust during that period. But Czapski was one of the Polish individuals who was tasked with sort of helping put together a couple of, battalions that could help the Soviet Union when the Nazis attacked them. And this then is his memoir of searching for the truth in Soviet Russia, trying to find out where are all of the Polish POWs, what has happened to the people of Poland, and really the horrors that have already happened in 1941, 1942. So this is a pretty intense book to read as well. And it certainly leads to the Finland Station by Edmund Wilson. Wilson is probably most famous for all his literary thinking and criticism, or sort of contemporary reporting. But this is an interesting book. Wilson early on was a firm believer in the progress of the Russian Revolution up into the Spanish Civil War. And he stayed with that longer than probably most of his peers. But by the end of the 1930s, he was recognizing, wait a second, like Stalinist Russia is a totalitarian regime. There's some pretty bad things happening. So he went into, this book is presented, it is exploring the sort of intellectual, philosophical roots of the Russian Revolution. And it's not just Marx and Engels and Lenin at the end. He hits those, but he goes before that and beyond that. We have Michel, we have ways in which there were revolutionary traditions from other European countries that were drawn on from the 18th century, from the 19th century, that were drawn on well before Marx put pen to paper. That said, this is not a book that is presenting this, rose-colored glasses view of the Russian Revolution or of revolution or of Stalinist Russia. This is someone who is now taking a very, very critical look at those strands of thought. And I think a lot of times we view some of those strands of thought primarily from the lenses of the Russian Revolution. And while Wilson's doing that, he is trying to get back at what were they actually thinking there. It's not just how did somebody take this and apply it in the 20th century, but what was actually being discussed and what were the ideas. So this is an interesting book. I'd be curious to know if anybody else has read this, just out of curiosity. And finally, A Savage War of Peace, Algeria, 1954 to 1962 from Alistair Horne. A very, very intense conflict, and one that I think presaged the rest of the 20th century and the 21st century. This book has been enormously relevant in the 21st century with Afghanistan, with Iraq. And Horne was writing about 15 years after 1962, but presents a very clear view of what was happening, both from the French government and the French military, from the Algerians themselves who wanted to be free, and the decolonial movements that were occurring around the world, and also getting into the lives of people who were French Algerians who were living in Algeria who ended up fleeing to France, and sort of their motivations, including some who were Muslim, who ended up fleeing to France. And so really trying to get into as many different facets of this period as possible. So again, I'd be curious to know how many have read this one as well. So these are some nonfiction selections from specific to the NYRB classics. Let me know which ones you've read, if you have other recommendations, and as always, I hope you're having a great week.